In this paper, I would like to discuss some problems and questions for a kind of possible approach to artifacts that combines insights from archaeology, paleoanthropology, anthropology, and phenomenology. This is really a work in progress, so I'm really looking forward to the discussion. And I will also be talking about expressions and signs in a somehow more general way or more concrete. So I will make some examples of how we actually find signs over the things that we use. That will be one of the questions that I will be talking about. So in general, I use the term artifact in a very broad sense to refer to those material things that whose relevance or usefulness, if you want, is more about their impact on minds rather than about what they do in the world. So I'm referring to quite different phenomena, like we can think of tools, symbols, fetishes, ritual objects, art objects. And these are very different phenomena, of course, but all what they have all in common, if you want, is precisely the fact that these things are relevant. They matter to our minds as long as they work on our minds. They have an impact on our minds rather than more than about what the things do in the world. And this has been interpreted in very different ways by reference to different contexts. And some scholars, for example, have been speaking in the last decade of agency of things, material agency, and so on. And I want to stress that here I'm suggesting to distinguish, and I will be making this distinction between tools and artifacts. But this is actually a methodological distinction, so it's not like there is a word where there are tools and useful things like tools and artifacts. It's more about a kind of intertwining between these two functions or sides of experience, between what things do in the world and what things do to our minds. And the challenge that I would like to try to explore here is precisely about when and how techniques, materials, and things that are relevant to us, for us because they are useful, when they become relevant in another sense because they are expressive, as we're going to see. And for example, I can think of a machine as something useful because it does something in the world, but also as a symbol of modernity. And we can have other examples of this. Another aspect that I would like to stress is that when we use artifacts, when we make artifacts, there is a different we involved, so to speak, as if the plurality of subjects is organized or articulated around, so to say, the visibility of the thing. So many artifacts, if you think about this, are owned just to be displayed. So there is a sense of sharing in artifacts, a sense of sharing with others that is not about a real exchange, but is not about what subjects can do with the things that they own. It's about what subjects see in the things that we display. So, for example, you have a ring. Using the ring means displaying, showing it to others. And the first very general question concerns what phenomenological approach to things can be used to elaborate a phenomenological approach to artifacts. So where is the possible place of artifacts in phenomenology? And then I would like to make this brief remark and recall how we can say that for both Husserl and Heidegger, things are always constituted through networks of synthesis and relations, through context of indications, what Heidegger calls Verweisungen, what for, in order to. And then both perception and handiness and human handiness work as a constant interplay of predelineations and partial fulfillment. And the idea that I would like to suggest is that we should try to place the emergence of artifacts precisely within the indicative or relational structure of perceptual experience and human techniques, and see how the expressivity of artifacts, the salience of artifacts on our minds emerge from the relational structure of our immediate experience of things through perception and relations of usefulness in Heidegger's sense. And I have in mind particularly Heidegger. And we know that for Heidegger, things are always constituted and encountered as being for something. But there is exactly a sense in which things or aspects of things are indicative beyond their being useful for something. So there is a sense in which things are expressive, are expressive not because they are useful, but because of the signs that we see on the things, and because the expressivity of things can generate new and if you want, strange relations of usefulness. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why we can say that the horizon of human handiness reaches beyond what is relevant and at hand in a strict sense. Is precisely that we have a way of making signs over the surface of the things that we use. And Heidegger, in Being and Time, rightly says that there is no such a thing as a tool, because a tool is always part of an interconnected totality of tools. And a tool makes sense only in relation to the other tools that we might need in order to do something, or that we might want to exchange with the others in order to achieve a common goal or to build something. But what I would like to draw attention to is that a tool can be more than a tool, not because of how it relates to other things, but because of what we read, what we find in the surface, in the external part of the things. So we have, for example, this basket is more than something useful to contain something. Doors and chairs are not just for sitting or for entering, and eating and drinking are not always straight and simple activities, also because of the signs that we make on these things. And again, the idea that I would like to explore here is that this expressivity of things is possible because of complex interactions or interplay between techniques and perception, because we are able to use together techniques and perceptual features. We were able to exploit the constructive patterns and perceptual features as variables of imaginary systems, in a sense that I hope to clarify in the following by reference to some concrete examples. So archaeologists and anthropologists have been increasingly concerned with the importance of materiality and artifacts for understanding key problems of human becoming, like creativity, symbolic behavior. And what we learn from the study of what is called material culture, and from approaches like material engagement theory, to put it very briefly, is that symbols and meanings are not abstract entities. They are relational properties that emerge in our concrete engagement with materials and techniques, and they are properties that emerge from the relations that things, materials trigger and enact. For example, scholars speak of an active sign or constitutive symbol to describe how human cognition and symbolic behavior is always the result of a constant and always open dialogue between mind, body, and materials. And what I would like to stress here is that is precisely the idea that symbols and meanings are what they are, and they are different because of the different ways in which they emerge in concrete material contexts. And in the light of these works in the field of archaeology, anthropology, we can say that the artifacts are the key for understanding human complexity, which means that instead of solving the mystery of why we did start using and making strange things like images or signs or artifacts, assuming that that these things are the result of a somehow already given complexity of our mind, we should instead try to solve the manifold mysteries of social and behavioral complexity precisely by looking into artifacts. So we should not ask, for example, what complexity of human mind or what complex forms of society can explain the fact that humans at a certain point of our evolution needed and started producing artifacts like images. We should instead investigate how a particular way of using things, materials, and surfaces triggered, motivated, and sustained more and more complex forms of sharing things with others, of thinking and imagining. For archaeologists calling Revije, the most decisive turn in prehistory came with the increase of the variety of engagement between humans and material world, mediated by the use of symbols. Quite rapidly, he says, material things then achieved new importance. And I want to stress that this new importance of things is precisely the fact that things were used, started being used as symbols. So he says that the development of social institutions can be seen as part of the process of the increasing engagement of humans with the material world. And one of the mysteries of prehistory is the emergence, he says, of inequality. And the key to inequality lies in worldly goods. So he says it is noteworthy that the hunter-gatherers of the Paleolithic did not apparently ascribe high value to durable materials. And he observes that amber, gold, and fine stones were used as beads for personal adornment only at a later date. And the crucial aspect here again is that things like gold or amber were used as symbols. The fact that we started wearing things in order to show something, not covering ourselves. Now, the study of artifacts and material culture conducted by archaeologists and anthropologists presents, I think, many important challenges, but also great opportunities for phenomenology, for an understanding of the constitution of things and for understanding the role that things play in shaping, in the making of sociality. And here I would like just to point out a few possible challenges, a few possible problems for a phenomenological approach to artifacts. So first of all, I think that in phenomenology, we should try to understand how making and using artifacts has things that have a particular impact on minds, involve a more or less transparent awareness of the imaginary nature of such experience, of the fact that artifacts work differently than tools, and then how exactly a belief or a trust in the cognitive power of things is triggered or enabled by perceptual experience, techniques, and materials. So this is a phonological aspect that I think many debates on the agency of artifacts in anthropology and archaeology overlook. I would like to make this example, this ethnographic example considered by Gell, an example that he uses as a sort of a model for thinking art object. We have here the front part of Kulas canoas that is richly carved and painted in order to demoralize the opponents. The efficacy of these boards, he says, stems from the powerful magical associations they have. The efficacy of this psychological weapon is not a direct consequence of the visual effects it produces, but rather of the fact that these visual effects are interpreted as evidence of a magical power. So the thing, he says, is not dazzling as a physical object, but as a display of artistry explicable only in magical terms. So in Gell's words, these are examples of how what he calls technology of enchantment is or becomes an enchantment of technologies. And what is phonologically relevant here, I think, is precisely this process that allows to be enchanted by the effects of a human technique. And of course, this process can be accomplished in very different ways with different forms and degrees of awareness and generating different kinds of artifacts and experiences. And in this concrete example, we see that technological skills are used in order to enchant, but this presupposes that the evidence of human skills is interpreted as evidence of a magical power. So the display of human artistry is taken as the index of a magical power. Now, I think that perhaps the idea of magic captures something, I think, essential, interesting of this phenomenon. And I think it's very important to recall that the production of this particular kind of artifact has the production of, in other contexts, of ritual objects, is itself part of a ritual, which might suggest that in a way, in order to do its trick, in order to be effective, this technology of enchantment, it must covers, in a way, within the ritual, it must covers it must hide the human nature of the technique. But I think that in general, it remains to be explained what kind of belief, what kind of attitude, what Zell describes as magic is about, and how it relates to perceptual experience and technological experience. So how is it possible that the lines and forms that are perceived as dazzling and that are indeed the result of the technique of carving the wood, how is it possible that this is interpreted as a work of magic? So where does this interpretation take place? When does it come into place, this interpretation? So what role do perceptual structures or cultural schemes play in making possible this enchantment? And I think that we can't assume that there is really a poor enchantment. So it's hard to believe that subjects are really the subject really confuse the efficacy of a real weapon and the efficacy of a psychological weapon. So, and if there is any kind of ambiguity between the working of tools, the working of weapons, and the working of these artifacts, this is precisely this ambiguity is something that we should try to explain. So it's a positive phenomenon that is somehow made possible by certain conditions and that we should explore. Now, I would like to consider another aspect where I think a phenomenological approach might give a contribution, and this concerns the elaboration, I would say, of a conceptual model or framework for understanding the constitutive role that artifacts play in the emergence, evolution, and in the transformation of symbolic traditions, and also for understanding the ways in which the exchange, the circulation, the movements of things and materials create complex encounters between and superpositions and contrasts between different symbolic traditions. And here I would like to suggest to try to look at Merleau-Ponty's concept of expression as symbolic institution and think of a symbolic tradition as a sort of trajectory involving both continuity and discontinuity, and where each moment or part of the trajectory is the occasion for new transformations, since the constitutive elements or the building blocks, if you want, of a symbolic tradition, namely the materials and techniques that are used, these elements are always to be re-engaged, renegotiated, re-explored in new contexts, in a new moment of history. And this happens in a way that we have a constant evolution in every symbolic tradition, so to say. So this is a kind of theoretical aspect that I won't be addressing in this paper, but I hope to show, in part at least, with concrete examples, how this idea might work. Another aspect where I think phenomenology might play an important role consists in the twofold challenge of interpreting the contingency and variability of symbolic traditions as determined by and always embedded in ecological and technological context, while also trying to identify the invariants involved in our expressive use of things, trying to identify, so to speak, the essence of human capacity of using and exploiting perceptual possibilities, materials, and techniques has expressive variables, has expressive possibilities. And we see all these materials, all these material qualities, they played a crucial role in human evolution as a symbolic species, and properties like resistance, luminosity, plasticity, rarity, all these properties were encountered by humans as functions of salience, as things that had a certain impact on minds. And each material, I would say, offers a particular perceptual salience, a particular way of being present, available in the mode of something rare, hidden, or ephemeral, something that we can find under the soil like gold, or falling from the sky like feathers. And I think that this variety is about reality itself. So in a way, it's about the variety of ecologies. And this variety of reality and ecologies reverberates in the variety of symbols that humans have been using in the history. And I think that's an important aspect, for example, today, where many ecological contexts are at risk. And as I said, this variety of materials and properties is about reality itself, but the question is that whether and why humans in a given moment or place of the history of the world value this or that material quality. This is something that depends on what materials are available, but also on how a society is able or unable to discover and manipulate these materials. And it depends on what pre-existing cultural, social, and symbolic conditions impact on the salience of the material. And I think that there are very interesting questions to ask at the intersection of archaeology and phenomenology about what there is of essential and what there is of contingent in human prehistorical and historical forms of engagement with these materials. And another question connected to this one is how, so to speak, the choices that were made in the past, in the recent past, or in human prehistory, determined a particular history of symbol, but also a particular symbolic mind, a way of making symbols, and the way of conceiving of humans as a symbolic species, because we don't make symbols in the same way in all the world and the history. And we can try, I think, to imagine the most different materials, qualities being articulated in different ways, creating relations with different domains of experience and generating different artifacts. And perhaps we can define this as a sort of eidetic variation that might instruct us about the contingency and variability of symbols and traditions, but also about the invariance of how human expressive engagement with things work in general, and how it might work on a different planet, on a different Earth, or how it might work for other intelligent beings. But of course, an interesting question here is to what extent we can imagine this. So what are the limits of our imagination when it comes with trying to imagine an ideal form of artifacts, possible form of artifacts? Now, I would like to go in a somehow different direction and try to consider a concrete example from the early Bronze Age of North Europe in the actual Denmark, where the male chiefly status was marked by beautiful crafted swords. So a beautiful crafted sword was a symbol of power. So scholars emphasize the importance of the transition from stone weapon to weapons made of bronze. And what I'm interested in is the symbolic implication of this transition from one material to another. How then the bronze, this different material affords more expressive symbol of power. And what I suggest to do here is to try precisely to look at this sword as a symbol of power, as a dynamic entity, as a trajectory, where we have to emphasize both the constitutive elements at the beginning of this trajectory, so to say, the constitutive elements like the relevance of weapons as things useful to the world, and the emergence, the increasing emergence and the elaboration of expressive salience. And this has to do with the fact that bronze weapons, and what is important to stress is that a kind of expressivity of things is always already in place, and it has to do with the fact that bronze weapons, for example, compared to weapons made of stone, were more difficult to make because resources and techniques, the craftsmanship, were not so available local. So swords made of bronze were more expressive of a certain dominance and control over materials and skills required to produce weapons. And it's very interesting to observe that the stone compared to the bronze affords a limited space of expressive possibility and variations. Its potential of salience is smaller. While bronze, on the other hand, affords a more complex manufacture, making possible more variable and complex variations and patterns, so that displaying a highly decorated sword is actually indicative of a control over a more complex and rare technique. But techniques and materials are not only present in the process of making of weapons, they are actually used to make a weapon that shows such control. So the forms and lines that make the sword beautiful, the carved lines, can be interpreted on the one hand as a display of the dominance over the highly complex skills required to make weapons. But these decorations must also be interpreted in the sense that those skills are used to make weapons, in the sense that the skills that are used to make weapons are used to do something different, like lines, signs, forms. And these things have nothing to do with the usefulness and the efficacy of the sword, but only they have to do with the salience, the expressivity of the sword as a symbol of power. And the sedimented relations that motivate since the beginning of the trajectory, the idea of bronze sword as a symbol of power, are not just repeated, they are renewed and enhanced and transformed through the introduction of morphological variations like these signs that are no longer connected with original constitutive aspects of the artifact, of the thing. And that we can see here that the power is not just about controlling the craftsmanship of the sword as a useful thing, is about controlling the making of signs and lines. So it's not like we have two words. The word has a useful thing and the word has an artifact, as a symbol. It's like we have two sides of the sword interacting with each other. One which has to do with the relevance of the sword as a useful thing, and one that has to do with the salience of the sword as an artifact. Then we have the effects of the blade to other bodies and the effects of the signs on minds. And what is interesting to observe, again, is how the salience of the thing introduces elements that are no longer or less related to the constitutive aspects of the thing as useful thing. And then the signs that we find on this word, since they are morphological variations that are no longer related to the particular kind of useful thing, sword, are signs that we can make and find in other artifacts, in other domains of experience. And in this sense, an artifact is something that works and operates at a different level, bringing together different domains of experience. And I would like to conclude with another example discussed in detail by the Italian anthropologist Carlo Severi. These are baskets produced by Ikwana and Wayana people, and their patterns we see are expressive of their mythology. And the important aspect here is that constructive patterns are intertwined with expressive patterns. So the mythology of these people is expressed by these figures, is based, this mythology, and also this ontology is based on transformations and variations. And this is because of how expressions are concretely made. So there is an ontology based on variations and transformations because of how expressive patterns and are constitutive of a mythology, but these expressive patterns depend on techniques and materials that are used to make a particular kind of useful thing, a basket. And what we learn here, I think, is that it's not like techniques and materials pose a limit or a constraint to a somehow pure or abstract capacity or faculty of expressing, a capacity of imagination. What is phonologically relevant is precisely how constraints that come from materials and techniques employed prescribe. They are a positive condition. They prescribe a unique form of expressivity, and in this way, this practice makes its own original way into into a way of imagining a original way into a richness and complexity of figures and the relations that are determined by transformations and variations. And to conclude, I think that we can define basket making as an expressive technique with emphasis on the one hand on the fact that these artifacts are expressions of a certain technique, but also emphasizing the fact that the making of such things has a making of expressions, takes techniques into an imaginary dimension, the one that shapes the very ontology of the world. And I would like really to conclude just by pointing out how the core problem of a phenomenology of artifacts as intended is this intertwining or interplay between the indications constitutive of useful things, the what for in order to in Heidegger's sense, and the expressive salience of things. And we can define science precisely as that kind of practice that allows us to manipulate the indicative structure of things, transforming the constitutive pattern of things into something we can manage and transform into a system of variables that are determined by their cognitive or imaginary dimensions, so to say. And I will conclude here. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Fabio, for your very insightful and very interesting. I would just stop your sharing.
Okay, thank you. I was trying to do it.
Yeah, it's okay. So thank you very much for your presentation, and I think that many issues have been addressed that also, especially for me, resonated with especially when you talked about the enchantment of technology and the technology of enchantment. They resounded with what is going on in our time. So, but please, I would like to ask if anyone has any questions. And yes, Sigurd.
Sorry, there we go. Thank you so much for a really interesting lecture. I was wondering, this is a part of phenomenology I've been wanting to go into for a while, and one question I've always been wanting to hear somebody answer with relation to this is, presently we have this technology of basically of artificial intelligence generated patterns and artificial intelligence related artifacts in a sense.
Yes.
How do you fit those those kinds of artifacts into this framework? Do you think to me it seems like very much possible to do so, but I would very much like hear your opinion on this.
Thank you very much. That's a great question. It's one, I think, of the major questions for perhaps for the phenomenology of artifacts. And I would just say that in one sense, the more we learn about the importance of materiality and of the embedded nature of expressivity in ecologies, technologies, the more we see what are the risks of digital technologies, precisely because you are creating artifacts through algorithms where the possibility of variability are predetermined by the mathematical framework in which the technology operates. So it's basically based precisely on the exclusions of whatever variable that is not predictable in that system. So the question would be how these can affect our existence and the importance that artifacts and salience and expressivity of existence has, how this would impact on that. And so the first way in which I think the kind of framework I'm trying to elaborate my address your question is by showing the importance of a material engagement at all levels, educational systems, in dealing with many other questions. So that's a first sense. The other, I think, is interesting in terms of a diagnostic. So how we came to digital technologies. And I always think about how we started making images in the cave, because we were able to exploit expressively all the irregularities of the surfaces, all the irregularities of the walls of the cave. And then we gradually came here. So it seems to me that there is a kind of history of a gradual disengagement from the variability of the supports that we use to make signs, for example. So in a way, we can see digital technologies as something that is taking us apart from the material embedment, from the embedded nature of expressivity. On the other hand, we should reflect more on to what extent what we call digital technology as a practice, still using artifacts, because you need computers to create digital technology, how this very practice is still in continuity with a certain kind of mind that has gradually evolved from the cave today. So I'm not sure it's a very question, but I think that is a crucial question. It's a matter of how we were able to show with concrete examples what it means that we erase, or that we gradually reduce the noise, the variables of our engagement with things. And here there is an important thing, and then I will conclude, is that we should look at other paradigms and models and examples of expressivity in other parts of the world. For example, cultures that evolved in an incomparable richness of biological diversity. You find other ways of making symbols, other ways of dealing with the overwhelming variability of materials and biological diversity. So that's, I'm not sure this is an answer, but that's actually a problem I'm always thinking about. But yeah, that's a crucial question.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much. There's a Gallagher recently, a couple of years ago, came out with this really interesting article where he looked at how these kind of generative machine learning systems had been used in biological research, and argued that it was functioning kind of like a form of eidetic variation, where they basically asked the machine to do a bunch of like variants of like what are the possibilities here, and then it's kind of functioning as an epistemic tool in some sense, rather.
And that's what is interesting. Yeah, but I mean, that's another question is exactly that. Sometimes you need the kind of variability that you can find only in reality, precisely to have better machines. You know that noise is important in certain systems because you need unaccountable variables in order, for example, to have better passwords. So that's a complex question, but I mean, thank you again for.
Yeah, of course. I'll stop talking now.
Thank you for the questions. We have another question from Daniele De Santis, please.
Thank you. Thanks, Fabio. It was great. Sorry, I had a connection issue, so I lost a couple of minutes. So hopefully, given our long-standing friendship, I will allow myself a critical question.
That's right.
Because also the title of your talk was this Phenomenology of Artifact, but I'm not very clear on what you mean by phenomenology, because in a very, very philosophical sense, phenomenology is nothing else but, classifying, mapping out different kind of artifacts, how they work. You use the expression variability several times. By the way, I was also under the impression that many of the differences you were emphasizing, using certain decorations rather than other, using certain material rather than other in order to something. I mean, to me, these are empirical distinctions. Using one material rather than another because it's more suitable in order to express something. I don't see anything particularly eidetic in the distinction. I see empirical differences that, of course, are relevant to the extent that there is an empirical plurality of cultures, and each one of them has an empirical different way of expressing itself. But then, of course, if you use phenomenology of artifact in the more rigorous and strict sense of the term, for example, meaning by that an ontology of artifact, then my question is very simple. Why should not all of these simply fall under the general term Geist in the sense in which Husserl uses it? When Husserl speaks of the phenomenology of Geist or the ontology of Geist, meaning a sphere of cultural and spiritual products.
Okay.
Because according to Husserl, if you take as a starting point the personalistic attitude, then since persons are spiritual subjects, whatever you encounter in the world is an expression of spirit, not simply of the subjective spirit, but what once philosophers would have called subjective spirit. So all of these are empirical distinctions, because you also mentioned there are different cultures and different ways of doing these things, but these are empirical differences, because all to the extent that the artifact falls under the general concept of Geist. So I'm not sure how this would impact and change our phenomenological eidetic perspective.
Okay. Thank you very much. Great question. So first of all, before getting into, I would say that what identify as the more phenomenological aspect of what I try to describe. So first of all, I would like to make clear that I was very concerned here with making concrete examples, which is part of the problem of which I have to answer. So I'm not saying, so I wanted to make concrete examples because I am in a moment of this kind of thing that I'm trying to do, in which I want to try to see the kind of from where to start. If I had to present another talk trying to address more your concern, I would emphasize more other theoretical aspects, for example, Merleau-Ponty. So first, there are different layers in the answer of your very important question. One is that I have always and most of the time in mind Merleau-Ponty. So perhaps I should make clear that I might be using phenomenology because I'm referring to a French phenomenologist. So that might be an aspect. Especially the concept of expression, the idea of that expression is somehow a kind of trajectory. So that's a first simple answer. One of my sources is a phenomenologist that we might discuss very much about. A second answer is the idea that you build up a phenomenology of artifacts starting from the fact that for phenomenology, things are constituted through indications. So I'm very interested in how literally indications on a perceptual level or aspects of perceptual experience, surprises, disappointment, contrast, whatever, how you can use this to construct artifacts. So this is a phenomenological aspect, how the fact that phenomenologists like Husserl or Heidegger have tried to reconstruct what is implicit in our experience of things, in our immediate experience of things through a chain or a web of indications, how this can be used to see what we do when we make science and we manipulate in a way this structure of things. So a second answer is about the idea that if you want, that things are a unity of manifold constituted by an interplay of anticipation. Because I think that, for example, surprise is a very interesting problem, disappointment. There are many situations and examples where artifacts are possible precisely because of this interplay. For example, the handkerchief knot, the knot that you make to recall you of something, its salience works on the basis, I think, of the fact that you are exploiting the function of a kind of useless tool. So you see a knot, you don't know what the knot is for, but you see that it was intended. So you see that there is a handiness there, but it surprises you, it captures your attention. So that's another answer. The phenomenological understanding of things might shed more light on the process and the structures involved in the salience, has a universal feature, I would say ethic in this case. I think that we can agree on the fact that whatever artifact we have in whatever planet, it needs to be salient and exploit features like surprise, contrast, color, and this kind of stuff. So my second answer is I see a phenomenological aspect in the fact that I think there is a kind of eidetic of silence, if you want. Last part, where your question is more strong, and we might talk about this more. The empirical, that's something I'm not sure how to answer to you because I'm really struggling with this. I'm not sure that I don't even know. I mean, is there a universal? How do we consider the fact that certain materials afford specific things? That there are things that you can do only with certain materials, and I'm not sure that if how to consider this is something eidetic. I mean, so I'm not sure how to answer, but I see your concern. I agree. So I think that the first answer that I gave you, I'm less sure about the last one, which is the very hard. So,
just one thing, then I will stop because it's late. Just to give you a possible way, take a look at experience and judgment, where Husserl discusses meanings and senses that can be embodied in just one time or one kind of material.
Okay.
Husserl had seen this problem, even though he never elaborated on this. For example, when he makes the example of the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican State, and he says it's a bound ideality because it can exist only once. So Husserl is not talking of the same, is not addressing the same problem you are addressing, but Husserl is aware that in certain cases, this kind of material rootedness is absolutely eidetic. So the material cannot change. So it is but I will stop because I see that also.
Yeah, but we can talk about, but thank you very much. That's great. Grazie.
So thank you very much. There is another question by Sigurd, but
yeah, I have a small comment if there's time, but if there's not, I'm happy to just take that outside of here.
Mm-hmm. Well, I suggest if you feel like discussing, of course, it is so it is. Being online, it makes also the constraint of not coming together when one could discuss this over lunch or something, where if this would be happening on site. So this is the
or a drink.
Yeah, or a drink, or yeah. So I would suggest the following. For the moment, I would conclude this session and invite and thank all the panelists and for all the ones who asked the questions, invite you all to join in the afternoon and evening sessions. But the line will be. I myself will just turn off my video. But if you want to discuss, still the line is open and. If you feel like discussing further, so please be welcome. Use the possibilities of Zoom. So thank you all very much, and thank you for your kind attention.
So Fabio, if you allow me, I this discussion just now made me really excited me because it's touches on a feature of phenomenology that I am really interested in, and a place where I think it actually I say, like, let me put this this way. I think your interest in materiality and it as a precondition for science actually is touching upon an internal conflict within the Husserlian and phenomenological framework at large. And I think it has to do with the role causality plays in the phenomenological theory. I think when you look at Husserl, his transcendental idealism commits him to a correlationalism, where upon which certain kinds or any kind of like objectivity is related to certain kinds of a certain form of consciousness. this fits very poorly with our understanding of how causal relations work. And you could arguably say that this is a conception, a problem that has hunted transcendental idealism even prior to Kant's publishing of the Critique of Pure Reason. Ironically, I think when you look a very interesting point of view, point where I think you could look, and I'd love to talk more about this, because it's a topic I'm very interested in myself, is in the second ideas, when you talk about the primacy of touch. There's a question: what is it that provides a question he never actually really answers? Is why has such a primacy in his account? He argues that it's only in virtue of touch that we can come to recognize ourselves as embedded in the world, and that is all touch is therefore also a precondition for entry into any kind of interaction with others. It plays like a very foundational role. What is it that make touch so such a central idea? And what I've always wanted to suggest is that it might just be that touch provides us a direct experience of causal realities that no other experience does, and like the experience of being affected and affecting upon the world actually provides us is an experience of being in a causal relationship with the world in a much more fundamental way than his transcendental idealism actually allows him to do. And if you accept this framework, then you can start to ask questions about, okay, how is it that materiality enables certain kinds of ways of engaging with the world, and this allows others. And the enabling there is clearly some kind of causal restriction in a certain extent, right? And I don't think you can clarify that kind of relationship between this eidetic variation and this kind of variation of just tools as science and so forth, without actually going into these questions about the role causation plays in Husserl's framework at large. And I think it might actually blow up his transcendental idealism in a certain extent. Not his phenomenological method, mind you, but I think it would no longer make it transcendental idealist as he formulates it. But yeah, those are my 2 cents.
Yeah. Thank you. No, I mean, that's very interesting and complex. So besides, there is Daniele here, so I wouldn't say anything about Husserl with Daniele being around. No, I mean, I'm not very, there are difficult questions. I'm not sure about how to position Husserl with regard to materiality, as you frame the problem. I know one thing, that if you look at many debates in archaeology, there are archaeologists writing papers about how there is this new materialism, which is a great thing, how phenomenology is just bad. So one of the reasons, perhaps, Daniele, and coming back to you, one of the reasons why I want to write phenomenology is also because I say, okay, if there is something good that can come from phenomenology, let's see it, because there is really it seems that there are people looking for things in new materialism, speculative realism, things that you can do better, way better with phenomenology. Is that sometimes we, or phenomenologists, are not so good in going to others like archaeologists and say, we can do that, So the concept of materiality, I've been really working a lot on debates on materiality and agency. And Daniele?
Oh, but I think that it's a good question. Is the remark he made is, we never met, so not nice to meet you. Is nice. I mean, my question at a very, very specific point, I mean, also taking into account what Sigurd just asked you. When you say phenomenology, the term is very ambiguous because you can either mean, let's take Husserl, phenomenology in the strict sense of the term, so the transcendental constitution, the theory of correlation, and whatever Sigurd just mentioned. But when you mean phenomenology, you can simply say the philosophy of a phenomenologist. And Husserl's philosophy includes also many non-phenomenological elements, because it includes, for example, the ontology of the material world and the ontology of culture. I mean, the ontology of culture is an eidetic, it's not phenomenology in the sense of the theory of correlation. It's an ontology of the cultural products and the relation between materiality. What I found extremely interesting about your talk is that by pointing out that in certain culture, and this seems to be like an invariant, that not simply meanings are expressed materially, but there seems to be certain meanings that can be expressed only through certain materials.
Yeah.
If this is the case, what you're pointing out, what you're pointing the finger at is not simply the kind of binded or bounded ideality that Husserl mentioned in Experience and Judgment, when he says, if you take the Sistina Chapel, then of course you can take lots of pictures of it, but this is an ideal object that can exist only one. Along this line, you could claim that the analysis of artifact point out the fact that there is a kind of type-based bound ideality.
Yeah.
Not idealities that can be embodied only one time, but there are idealities that seem to be embodied and can be embodied only in certain type of materiality.
Yeah. Okay.
This is something that Husserl has not seen, and as far as I'm concerned, this is don't find it in Merleau-Ponty. If you pursue this line, this is something really new, because Husserl, the region Geist, is a founded region. So you always need a material layer. There is no it's completely impossible for Husserl to think of cultural objects, artifacts, signs, and whatever it is without a material support. Even religion, for Husserl, like a form of spirituality that has not a material support, is ontologically impossible. But what you are emphasizing, that's why I ask you, are these empirical variations or not?
Okay.
There are variations, but here the variations seem to have a limit. What is the limit? It's not this piece of bronze, but is the fact that this ideal meaning needs to be embodied in bronze.
Yeah, that's exactly my point. So my point with variations were about the functioning in general of salience. So let's say that we are Star Trek. There is gold in
Wait a second. Stop for a second. I think, however, that you should be very careful in using the word salience, because whether you're using it in the Heideggerian sense or whether you're using it in the Husserlian sense, Husserl uses it before Heidegger, you are already bringing in the transcendental dimension of the subject. And I think you should simply do in your research should be like a two-step operation. I'm speaking how Husserlian is, but you don't have to do it in the Husserlian way. It's simply to clarify. You first need to have an eidetic of artifacts. Then, once you clarify what kind of eidetic object an artifact is, then you can bring in the transcendental dimension and you clarify, given the specific peculiarity of your ontological domain, what kind of relation the subject can have to this domain. Because the point is, between the two opposites, you have two opposites. The first pole is the Sistine Chapel. It is an ideal meaning that can exist only once. On the other end, you have infinite variability, because, for example, you can have certain ideal meanings that can exist in any kind of material determination. For example, take, I don't know, like the Christian cross. It can be made of wood, can be made of glass, whatever it is. In between, you have identified something new, namely that there are certain ideal meanings, a certain type of sense that can exist in a multiple way, and yet always embedded in the same kind of material.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things I'm very interested in is when you change the place of an artifact. The cross. There are several examples. You put the cross. You forgot your cross in a village, in a place in Africa. You go back after 3 years. It's another cross, is another thing, and it can generate a kind of meaning which is quite unique, because it depends on whether you are leaving the cross in a place where there is a religion X that has already cross expressions, or where you go 40 kilometers in another village where there is the same religion, but they don't have this kind of artifact already. And I mean, it's interesting. And if you see the description of the last example I made of the baskets, the first ethnography that went there, they asked the people to make drawings, images of their mythology, and it was quite simple, like a drawing of child,
But if it is the case, then you need to answer Sigurd's objection, because if you are considering also this dimension, you take a specific the collectivity, the subjectivity that experience the object, then you need to really answer and find a counter objection to Sigurd's objection, because no matter whether you take Husserl, you take Heidegger, you make Merleau-Ponty, then he's right. Here you have a form of correlationism or correlativism that might not be the most suitable way to address this point, precisely based on what he was saying.
In what sense? Sorry. In what sense?
I mean, Sigurd, if you like jump in, because that was more or less your point, that a form of correlativism probably is not the best form to address this problem.
Right. Yeah. What I wanted to say is that this is me trying to take like something I've thought about in a one way and just like throwing it into new ones. So bear with me. The way in which like you're describing a kind of like material suitability, right? In which like the suitability of the material allows for some kinds of cultural expressions over others. And I think the best way to clarify that would be to make a reference to the object's causal features, to its the way it interacts with us, right? But this is something that phenomenologists say very, very little about. It is something that I guess the only one who really I have yet to read Ingarden's third any of his like Magnus any aspect of his Magnus opus, but the third book there is basically about the causal structures of the world. But my only point, as far as is that I think you might end up hitting on some conceptual ambiguities in trying to clarify what kind of constraints this materiality places on cultural on the kind of expressivity allowed within like the cultural sphere, because that constraint is so is underdeveloped within phenomenology as such, and it's something that I mean, on the one hand, as I think like my talk of correlationalism is in a bit in a way a bit misleading, because like you can say that we all you can make the claim that you experience causal relations in the world, but the only causal experiences that relates to that we can relate with are the ones we actually experience. So it just as a simple fact are the causal constraints that are relevant for cultural expressions are the ones are the ones that we actually experience, right? But in describing the exact nature of that constraint, what that constraints amount to, phenomenological language might be a bit unclear, because it seems to be operating on on the basis of a modality that is not captured by this correlational framework.
Yeah, I see.
And that is a very nuanced point, because it doesn't actually have it doesn't necessarily have a it doesn't have an implication in that you can't like point to one point like you see here. It can't deal with this place.
I mean,
but nevertheless,
I mean that is actually important indeed, because one of the questions about in what sense phenomenology, it's about how, for example, I use the term constraint, which and I see that might be ambiguous. Maybe it's not a good term. I mean, I wrote it in the slide, and so maybe I'm realizing that it might be good. But I think it's important, because especially if you want to understand the kind of trajectory of history, of destiny of artifacts, what they can do by moving them, for example, you have to distinguish, or I have to distinguish, when there is something about its materiality which is external to the correlation, so to say, or I mean, I can have a constraint which has to do with what I can see about how I can use something. And if you move the same thing, material, in another culture, you might have people there that are not seeing the constraint. They can use the artifact in a way that you can see possible.
Oh yeah, that is
constraints that are
sorry. I'm sorry for breaking in, but I think like here you can talk about two different kinds of constraints. Then, on one hand, what you'd speak about there is a kind of a cultural constraint, a spiritual constraint.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, there are two kinds,
and that is a constraint that is it's about how this object has been taken up into the culture.
Yeah,
and placing it into a new context.
In the section where there are gold and all the materials, it depends. There are society that they just don't care about that kind
exactly.
of material. So they don't see any relevance or salience in the gold compared to feeders or
right. So let me just suggest like this. You can talk about like first cultural constraints. And then you have a wider set of just within like the causal structure of reality, which we see, there's a wider set of just what you can call like causal constraints, right?
I'm just thinking whether it makes sense. If there is a sense, it makes sense to speak of constraints if you are not inside the culture. I mean, what's the point of?
I mean,
of thinking in terms of you have to go.
Yeah, I gotta go. Yeah.
Grazie, Daniele.
I have
Thank you very much.
House obligations. So thanks, Sigurd. It was a pleasure to meet you. Fabio, great. Keep talking.
Likewise, Daniel. Let's. I would. I really enjoyed this. I would. I'd love to talk more about all this. But the reason, let me. Sorry. Let me say why I think it's. You need to. You can talk about also the constraints given by the material itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is a kind of causal constraint, because it's about like its materiality in itself.
Mm-hmm.
And that on this, from within this frame, causal level causal constraint, you can actually there's allows for a certain kind of creativity, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's still kind of like you can discover new ways of interacting with the same material, where one culture can appropriate the causal features of the object in a way that hasn't that the other, because of cultural constraints, did not immediately see.
Mm-hmm.
So you I think you do want to talk about like causal and then cultural constraints.
Yeah,
and I think here's the interesting thing, like especially when you talk about like, let's take the like if how to understand those causal constraints is one thing that phenomenology might not provide you that much to work with. I think like there's some in like Merleau-Ponty talking about like the world having a certain kind of style.
Merleau-Ponty.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and this is a very vague way of talking about like constraints. And let's just like
Yeah.
take a let's take but if you take this like into its sort of just like take this into a metaphysical context, right?
Yeah.
Because imagine like you take like your idea concept of a alien, I think was very is very helpful. Like we can imagine, for example, an alien culture due to its like sense apparatus having access to parts who are to other causal features of the world than we have, right? Because so here we're talking about like a relationship between the world and our sensory apparatus, but because we can also talk about that, it's also
you see, that's the point, is exactly that with a different system of perception, with a different sensorial apparatus, you might have access to more material possibilities.
Yeah. And this is
that, but the question about invariance, which I should try to make more clear, is about, let's assume that with your alien sensorial, with your alien smell, you can detect patterns.
Yeah.
Well-defined. It's more and more sophisticated in a way that you can exploit smells. Your alien way of doing art or science or symbols with smell would still work on the basis of certain principles, like salience, like to see something and to distinguish the book that you read from the title. You need, kind of salience. You need to distinguish what about the thing is about something that you touch with your hands, and what is about. I mean, I've been working on a paper on lines. Lines are incredibly indicative, because there is something in the ecology of our perception that makes us familiar with perceptual ambiguities. But there is a way in which we learn to cope with perceptual ambiguity, so that when you see a line, is not the false deception, the deceptive indication of an edge that does not exist. It's more than the edge of a real space, you see. So in an alien world, you would still need a kind of structuring, a basic working of salience. That was my point. So you can have a kind of gold which is not about the resistance of the material, but it has to be salient for some way or another. And concerning, I think that a way concerning what we are saying might be by starting from the material constraints and see how precisely cross-cultural use of artifacts might show the variance, the difference. So you see, when you have two ways of using the same material as expressive possibilities, because not every cultural use of or encounter of a material, it doesn't exhaust the real possibilities. So that's, I mean, you see the difference between the material constraints. There is things that you can do with material. There are things that you can see that you can do with materials.
So I want to just to I want to like just propose like a metaphysical framework and then see how you think about it.
Just
because where you are right now, like everything which you have said until this point is like it's something one can express within the transcendental idealist correlationist attitude, right? Because talking about like correlations between different ways in which beings are experience the world and how the world is. But when you think about this invariance between different kinds of sense apparatus, it seems very reasonable to then think that it's very much that different features of the reality could be present to someone with different senses, it seems like it seems reasonable to say that it's a logical possibility that there are causal features of the world that are that could be present for no senses, and give it's no matter like how advanced our scientific methods become, we nevertheless end up never being able to sense these these features in any way.
Yeah,
and if you if that is a logical possibility, then correlationalism is false. That is purely then, and I think this is kind of important for us to understand the actual constraint materiality places on our subjectivity, because it is actually there. It is a reality which we cannot act, which we can only upon which we depend in a stronger sense than what it is, what the transcendental idealist line allows us to do. And I think this is kind of this is a problem you're going to I think phenomenology like treats these problems incredibly helpfully. I think like Husserl's early talk about like crisis about like development of geometry, for example, is clearly incredibly relevant, right? But there's a conceptual ambiguity at the heart of like phenomenologist treatment of materiality, I think.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I totally agree with that. You know, that's just to conclude, let's say that, I mean, this is a kind of project that I'm trying to do. And, you know, when sometimes this is a kind of existential philosophical issue, you know, sometimes you just don't know where you have to. I mean, I do feel that I should do some legwork on theoretical aspects. Like you mentioned a metaphysical take of the problem, not only phenomenology, other phenomenologies. On the other, I keep reading stuff on archaeology, paleoanthropology, and that's what, you know, a postdoc is supposed to be. You should have 3 years maybe and work out everything. So, but your insights are very important, because I'm using these ideas to write project applications, you know, and what makes an application strong or not is also the question. If you are aware of what other sources you should consider in philosophy and not, I mean, so that's really all helpful what we have been discussing. So I'm really thankful to you for this.
Actually, I think in source, I think like Husserl's ideas is incredibly interesting, and also how this has been treated in by Armstrong, and you know, the Australian philosopher who wrote this book on bodily sensations in the
I got it.
Also, which could be interesting, is there's I know that there's been some work on like just relationship between causal apprehension and tool behavior in among cognitive science, within cognitive science. And that could be an interesting.
And then you have post-phenomenology. There is really a lot of stuff. I mean, also, I mean.
But yeah, I don't know. I just flagging like that you're actually touching on causality and its relationship to subjective meaning.
That's great.
That is kind of like my main point.
I mean, that's I mean, that's really important to kind of find a different perspective on the same problem, not because you're saying read this, try to read that, but try to think of another concept. I've never thought about causality, to be honest, but it might be that kind of concept that reshapes, you know, the perspective in a good way, that helps clarifying what are the issues to a different audience, maybe. So I'm always concerned about how this kind of projects sounds to someone doing research in analytic philosophy or doing research in history, whatever, So that's might be this is a really great
actually
advice.
like and one thing also, like just recent years, there's been a lot of I mean, you might know this better than I for what I know, but in recent years there's been a lot of work on alternative causal frameworks than the traditional Humean idea of causal necessity, right? And taking up the fact that this way of thinking of causality is not really how like biologists, for example, think of causality.
Yeah, that's exactly.
And you have Rani Lil Andrum here in Norway, and Stephen Mumford, who has been really working a lot on dispositionalism and taking up like these Aristotelian ideas of Aristotelian ideas of causality. This is kind of I'm doing my PhD right now. But if I was to like just like my dream postdoc project would basically be to just take like phenomenology and like the problem of causation and like just see like how do we fit it in?
Yeah.
Can we even? But yeah, I think like those kind of because they talk a lot about just different kind of materials having different powers, different objects having different powers.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
That is my like, and that's that kind of power ontology.
Yeah.
Might be actually what you're what you're looking for here.
Yeah,
I can send you some links to some. I mean, I know I'll find your email on that. I can send you some link to their
please.
books.
I mean, I will contact you for sure, because I'm really, if you have time to give me some feedbacks on other projects. And
oh yeah, of course, anytime.
Great,
and I think this is this is something that really excites me. So I think this is I would love to do that.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, the idea of causality, it never occurred to me, but I see that because there are a lot of expressions that we use, especially when you are trying to do something somehow new, or and I realize that I try to see, I speak with others of a cognitive power of things, and then of salience, the salience that things have on minds, but I see that this is just because maybe I come from a certain phenomenological perspective, and my eyes is always on the salience.
Right.
So I take for granted that the power of things on minds is a matter of salience. But now I'm seeing that someone else coming from a different perspective, from a different philosophical perspective, may say, for me, the cognitive power of things on minds is a power.
Yeah. And like, well, and here's like the interesting thing. You can talk about, maybe then you can talk about salience to talk about the cultural constraints. And you can talk about causal powers as to how to really, talk about like the material constraints. Because like you can't. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, the great thing might be precisely to try to use positively the concept of causality, precisely because it doesn't fit very well in phenomenology. So you say, we have the cognitive power of things on minds. In phenomenology, we can try to analyze, with the help of phenomenology, the cultural side of the story, the fact that there is a cognitive power of things on minds in terms of salience.
Yeah.
But then when we move or consider the material side of the problem, and we don't want to restrict or narrow down or to reduce the impact on minds to the salience, to something that is about how we perceive and see things, then we move in a different conceptual framework where power is power. So that's something that sometimes it's just great to go outside phenomenology for a moment and say, okay, it's more strict, Yeah.
And clearly, like the power you perceive it to have is identical with its salience, but it's the power it actually has is not identical to its salience.
Yeah, that's great, really. And something the reason why I was very interested in the example of this word, which is another aspect that might take that might take the problem outside phenomenology in terms of causality, and it's the fact that the expressivity of the first sword as symbol of power is not about any intention. It's not about any intention of communicating something. It's really the expressivity of the thing, because ontologically, a dagger made of stone is not like a dagger made of bronze. That's all.
Exactly. Yeah,
That's
and
different.
and so what so cultural development will always be in certain ways restricted by like the causal the causal environment.
That's.
Sorry.
Sorry. I was just thinking about how important this is. I mean, I'm not sure about how phenomenologically you can really address many concerns about ecological issues, because the most of the time when we are concerned about ecology, we are concerned about a variety that is not really easy to think in a phenomenological perspective. So what does it mean caring the survival of one species? So I mean, how do you make sense of this care for something unique for I don't see the connection with it. It's about the reality, it's variety, so it's not something that. So that's but I mean that's really helpful, the idea of causality, and I think we agree on the fact that we could.
No, I think so too. This is really interesting, and I was about to say one thing. I would say that it's not just that phenomenology. I think phenomenology can do more than just like deal with the cultural, because the phenomenology is also transcendental discipline. So you can also speak to the transcendental conditions for you to experience such causal powers as such, and therefore also can therefore define like the limitations and of this kind of language, and delineate like a basically do what Husserl does tries to do in the second ideas, delineating different ontological spheres from one another. It still has you could argue that it still has has the power to do this within this sphere, and that that can be helpful also for that that reason. But it's kind of like if you accept this framework, you're kind of going closer to you're ending up closer to Kant in a way, where you're saying there's a way in which there's we're on the island of the senses. We can explore those, and we can reason can tell us that and then there's like this foggy sea where we can say next to nothing about, but that is not the same as saying that we can say nothing about it. We can actually talk about, like within this framework, it makes sense to talk about a thing in itself as a kind of limit idea of the notion of conversation.
This is one of the many aspects that really brings the problem of artifacts really close to many concerns about reality. And a last one I was very interested is the notion of temporality, because there are very good scholars in archaeology doing interesting things with the concept of temporality. For example, trying to focus the temporality on artifacts, and that's another kind of way in which you have to take a position to think what kind of conceptual model you want to work with when you have to account for the history of artifacts. So what kind of history is that? It's not like a temporality in phenomenological sense. So that's another question, I would say. So you can account for the constitution, for the temporal constitution of the artifact in the sense of what's structure of retention, protensions, primal present, recollecting, habitus, and whatever is at the basis of you perceiving the artifact, but you can't account in that sense for the kind of temporalization that an artifact brings into play, bringing without you knowing, bringing a trajectory. I mean, just there is a history of things that is really about what things do.
Yeah.
Because they involve a history. They are just making happening a history. You bring an artifact from one tradition into another. You are bringing a history. Well, anyway, so that's really helpful. I will be in touch with you. I've been working also on the topic of noise. That's why I was very interested with the question of digital technology, because I'm collaborating with a guy on digital noise, pseudo noise, and analog noise, and so
definitely. I'm currently doing a PhD as a part of a larger project at the Peace Research Institute Oslo about how the introduction of military technology might change military combatants' capacity to enact moral judgment. So whether there are environmental factors, if our moral judgment depends on certain kinds of environmental factors, so that changing the technological environment might change our
that's
base.
great. Sounds great.
I mean, it is what we're doing, but like, as you might note, these like this is what I do because it's what I could get paid for to do a PhD.
Yeah,
but then there's like this
I know
stuff.
I sometimes, I have Kant, Hegel here and everything. Sometimes I just wish to go back in my first years. I can just open a book, write with the pen, not even a PDF, just theoretical. Anyway,
it strikes me that this could be an interesting thing to think about as a application to write. Basically talking about phenomenology and causation, and then just gather a bunch of people that deals with like materiality and different aspects of causality, and then basically just ask, here there make the claim like, here there's a lacuna within like traditional phenomenology. It has shaped how a lot of these conceptual frameworks thinks about certain kinds of cultural objects, and actually going back and looking into this, looking what happens when we like try to put causality in and deal with like the kind of like the kind of ontological claims that like our common sense conception of causality seems to demand that we do, could
that's great.
Help clarify these concepts in some like very helpful ways.
That's great. Thank you very much. Really, that's it's incredible, because sometimes you approach online conference. That is the number 7 of the year for me. So I was kind of used, the first one last year was great, okay.
Oh yeah.
Now it's kind of, people disappearing. And so it's really great that it turned out to be quite a positive confrontation, like we are in presence. So
I'm very glad. I feel the same way. I'm not surrounded by phenomenologists that much for daily at a daily level. Like, part of being at the Interdisciplinary Research Institute is that you're kind of like the representative of your field more than among colleagues. So to me, I think that is why I'm just like coming to this with like all this energy. Like
that's great.
But so let's keep in touch. This seems really interesting.
I will send you an email during the next week. I have some things to finish, but you will hear from me for sure. And great. I'm writing some project about this, so I will feel free to send you. And if you have just time to take a look,
of course.
I don't expect you to have the time to read it, but
please. I mean, the best thing about being a PhD student is that you have
some time to do that.
You have some time to do stuff like that.
Of being a PhD, but there is the upgrade of being a PhD, which is being unemployed. So you have even more time.
Exactly. I kind of feel
That's,
it is.
it's in between. Theoretically, it's great because that's what means independent scholar. So you will hear from me. Okay.
Great. Let's keep in touch.
Yeah. Thank you, Sigurd. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fabio. Yeah, and thank you again for a really interesting lecture. I really enjoyed it. I hope
great.
you can tell.
Thank you. Ciao.